Obviously, reporting during the pandemic was challenging enough from just a logistics standpoint, not to mention the story. And then we have all of the race-related issues that have come following the death of George Floyd. And I have to tell you, I haven't told you this, but one night after the news, I was noticing things on Twitter, as I'm wont to do, and I saw you didn't just go home after work, you went to a protest to try to learn more about it. And I found that fascinating. And tell me why you found it interesting to talk to the people on the street as a protest was happening.
So it was, I was hanging out in the newsroom, finishing up some loose ends after the 10 p.m. newscast, and we were hearing there was a protest that had recently started, was our understanding, in front of the Cedar Rapids Police Department. And I was like, I'll just swing by on my way home and check it out. And if it's really big and there's a lot going on, I'll call back to the station and get, somebody with an actual videographer, a camera. But no, I went, it was small, it was chill. It was, I got out of my car to just sort of hear what people were saying, and people recognized me. This was also around the time when there were those rumors. There were truckloads of people from Chicago or fill in the blank big city, busloads coming in to, rob us and blah, blah, blah. And those were debunked, but they hadn't been truly debunked yet. So I was like, these protesters are from right here. They knew who I was. They're like, oh, weren't you just on the news? And there was a group of younger people who just engaged with me and shared stories of, I was curious, why are you here? Why are you doing this? What motivated you? They referenced George Floyd and how horrifying it was to watch him die. They also talked about, well, these are our friends, and they asked us to come out. And we agree with what they're saying, that something has to change. And I go, well, be specific. What do you want to see change? And one young woman, and I'm going to show my own bias here, she had a lot of tattoos. I go to work and have to look a certain way and act a certain way, and she was probably 25 years my junior and doesn't follow those rules, if you will. And she snapped to attention, looked at me, and she goes, well, I'm a beautician, and I'm a stylist, and it took me longer to get my license than it is to be a police officer in this city. And I thought to myself, well, that's not right. I didn't believe her. Mm-hmm. And I went back and did research, and we ended up doing a story on that exact angle of the X amount of weeks it takes to be a police officer at the academy. I believe it's 13 weeks, is significantly less than the months and months it takes to become a stylist in the state of Iowa to get your license. Now, there's a lot of on-the-job training after you become a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, or a state patrol person, absolutely. But in terms of actual classroom work, it was quite a gap. So I didn't feel threatened or scared at all, although the station policy is never cover a protest alone. I guess I technically did, but I don't think there were more than like 40 people there.
But it gave you insight into the mindset of those who were, and I'm going to be using the phrase, peacefully assembling, as opposed to a whole different cohort of individuals, some of whom may have been from out of town, some of whom didn't have as pure a motive. And so you were able to really tell, this is what our good hometown people think, and it's worth listening to them.
Yeah, they were very earnest that the police, even though they were standing in front of the police department, were not the problem per se. We really, like, why are you here? Why protest here? And the police had come out and cordoned off the road in front of the Cedar Rapids Police Department for this pretty small group, so they could be in the street. And they just said, the one young man who's African American, he said, I've been pulled over before, and I should have been pulled over each time, and they were really nice to me and let me go. And didn't cite me, just gave me warning. I guess I've had a good run. And I go, was that always in Iowa? And he said, yeah, it's always been in Iowa. So also to get that perspective from a young man who is a young man of color saying, I haven't had negative experiences, but I still feel like the system as a whole needs some tightening up.
This was not the end of the reporting, obviously. You did some extended reporting, and this is not the thing that these days with budgets and staffing, with people's attention span, we always are told, do shorter stories and shorter segments because we don't want to lose the audience. That's true whether it's radio or television, but you just did an extended piece that had some pretty interesting results with regard to economic disparity. Talk about that.
Yeah, so we did this 1 hour special around the Black Lives Matter movement here in Iowa, and my charge was explore socioeconomic disparities between white and black people and figure out why they exist. So I'm like, what? I think people do their whole dissertations in college on one teeny tiny angle of this, and I'm just going to sum it up for a TV program. No biggie whoop.
And
So
just a part of a 60-minute whole. You get a part of a whole, and that's your topic. Yeah, that's daunting.
Yeah, so I did research. I talked to experts. At the end, I had 15 pages of notes that I took exploring this issue, and I couldn't cover all of it, obviously. So the angle that I took, because this was the experts told me, was the root cause of the wealth gap in America between white and black people was access to home ownership. And I had never heard that. I didn't know that was really a big thing, just to show you how ignorant I was to the history of this country in a lot of ways and how much of a bubble I live in. I'm a white, middle-class woman in my whole adulthood, and I do have a limited perspective on the world. But when I learned that 30% of black people in Iowa own homes compared to 75% of white people, that was surprising to me. And then to peel back the layers of why.
So what were some of the reasons? I mean, there are people who are listening to this conversation who might say, well, it's a smaller sample size. It might have to do with family dynamics. It could be a variety of things. But what did you find is the underpinning of that large a disparity among ethnicity?
Well, when I talk to, because obviously I'm not the expert here, so I had to turn to people who are a lot smarter than I am on this topic. I talked to Dr. Colin Gordon from the University of Iowa, who researches the wealth gap between races, not just in Iowa, but in the Midwest, and including the upper Midwest. And then Dr. Julian Hayter, an associate professor at the University of Richmond. And what they shared with me was that if you look at policies in the United States dating back to Civil War era, pre-Civil War era with the Homestead Acts, it handed land to white people and invited them to grow and prosper, whereas black people were obviously cut out of that opportunity because they're still enslaved. Fast forward to the 1930s, when you had the Federal Housing Administration that wanted to boost home building and home ownership after the Depression because there wasn't enough housing, that they created what's called redlining. And I'd heard of it, but I didn't really get it, and I didn't really understand it till I saw a redlining map.
And so this means what? Again, we've heard the phrase, but what does it mean in practice?
So these were government-created documents that showed parts of a community that banks should and should not lend to. So you get a mortgage if you live in a green area, or it's easier to get a mortgage. You're really not going to get an institution to lend to you if you live in a red area. And in the red areas, even if you were an African-American family of means and you were middle income, because you were black, the government determined your area as red. And the way they described it in these maps, I mean, it's truly offensive to some of your listeners. It would describe certain areas as poor white trash live here, avoid. Next to colored section, avoid. And to see that this was not created by private institutions or, you know, the KKK, this was created by the federal government as guidance for financial institutions. And to be clear, this was 90 years ago. So how does that change where we live in today? Well, as the experts told me, think of in your family the first generation to get a house. And what that meant is that they had equity in that home ownership. And for most Americans, most wealth is tied into home ownership. So when you lose a job, or you need to borrow money for a kid's education, or you just fall on hard times, or you need to fix up your home, you often can draw on that home equity. And then when you pass away, you give that wealth to the next generation and give them a leg up. Then they have a better position to buy their own home. This isn't as simple as I'm making it sound, like, oh, we have this disparity today because of these two acts. That's not true. There's much more. So I focused on policies that prevented black people from achieving equity and wealth.
You mentioned that this redlining was nearly 100 years ago, but it was happening 6 decades after the Civil War.
Yeah.
So to put it into context, we had not moved from a governmental standpoint very far in, 3 generations post-Civil War, which again is of some concern as you try to put context into how people feel today.
And Dr. Julian Hayter, who's at the University of Richmond, grew up in Des Moines. His parents were solidly middle income. His mom worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield. His dad worked for John Deere. And they lived in a redlining area because even though it was illegal to discriminate them and make black people, because he is a black man, only live in certain parts of the city, on the books it was no longer legal, but it still happened more through the private sector and through people's behavior. Realtors at the time would say things, you're going to feel more comfortable living in this neighborhood, and would steer people, which is illegal today, even in the private sector, but it still happened in his experience. And so he said, I grew up in a red line neighborhood of Des Moines. The schools were not as good as the places outside of that. And if you layer the redlining maps over your most impoverished neighborhoods in the universe, in the state and in the country, those impoverished neighborhoods were also redlined 90 years ago. So it didn't stop when the practice stopped.
Reminder, we're talking with Beth Malicki of TV9 about reporting that our coverage partners have done with regard to the issue of race and equality and justice, which again, a very broad topic, and we're talking about just a small part of it this morning here on News Talk 1540 KXEL. So you were surprised, and I've told the audience this, I'm a getting to upper middle-aged white male, born and raised in Iowa. I have no idea what it is like to walk down a street and hear car doors lock as a car drives by. I have experienced certain bits of discrimination, but not on a daily basis. And so it's impossible for me, I would contend, to truly understand. But this kind of stuff that you're talking about tends to give an individual at least better acknowledgement and understanding of the foundation that others have to live with on a daily basis. Is that fair?
It's very fair, and you're right. I was not able to encapsulate every single aspect that drives a wedge between the races when it comes to wealth. I don't know how long that documentary would be, but it would be a doozy. I really focused on how the government kept people from home ownership. You know, I think of my husband's family when Grandpa Ward came back from World War II, and he was a bomber, and he survived the war, which was tremendous given his role in World War II. And through the GI Bill, he was able to build a home, and they raised 6 children. And what a gift from the government to have that leg up through the GI Bill. 4.3 million home loans were created in America and given to veterans because of that program. But 1 million African Americans were cut out of the GI Bill, even though they served in World War II. So even after redlining ended, the discriminatory practices that prevented people to achieve the American dream still existed.